You ever wake up and find your entire life turned upside down in a single moment? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. Ben Reynolds stood on the porch of his cabin, staring at the spike strips that had been laid across the entrance, blocking his only way out. The scent of fresh-cut pine mingled with the bitter stench of gasoline and rubber, the smell of the newly installed trap that had been set by someone he trusted to be just another neighbor. But no, this wasn't just any neighbor. This was Kyle Harris, the man who had decided to play God with his land. Ben had always dreamed of owning this cabin, a family heirloom passed down through generations. It wasn't much, just a humble cabin nestled among the trees, far enough from the hustle of the city to offer peace, but close enough for Ben to feel connected to the world he once knew. A place to get away from the grind of his job in software engineering. But today, that dream was under threat. The old, familiar feeling of unease crept up on him as he gazed at the spikes, cold, metal teeth digging into the dirt like they owned the land. Ben's heart raced. How did it come to this? The HOA had always been a part of the neighborhood, but Ben had never thought it would come to this. They were supposed to be here to help, to keep the peace, not to make him a target. Ben wasn't a confrontational person by nature. He was quiet, kept to himself, did his work, and rarely made waves. But Kyle Harris, the HOA president, was a different breed. Ben had seen the way Kyle carried himself, always with a smug grin, always with a sense of superiority. Kyle wasn't just any neighbor. He was the kind of guy who thought rules applied only to others, not to him. And now, that same arrogance had led him to cross the line. Ben had always known Kyle was a bit of a bully. The type to complain about the tiniest things, the color of your mailbox, the way your grass was mowed, the fact that your fence didn't line up perfectly with his. But Ben had never expected Kyle to go this far. This wasn't a petty complaint. This wasn't a simple warning about his overgrown lawn. This was full-on sabotage. Ben had been out of town for a week, attending a conference for work, when he got the call from his neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. She'd sounded frantic. "Ben, you need to get back here. Kyle's been going around telling everyone he's taking over your property." At first, Ben thought she was exaggerating. But when he got back to the cabin, the sight that greeted him was beyond what he had imagined. The spike strips were only the beginning. His gate had been torn down, his fence had been cut, and his driveway? It was now blocked with piles of dirt and construction materials. Kyle had taken it upon himself to upgrade the property, and in doing so, had effectively locked Ben out of his own land. Ben's hands shook as he walked around the perimeter, taking in the full scope of the damage. It wasn't just about the physical destruction, it was about the audacity of it all. Kyle hadn't even bothered to talk to him, hadn't even given him a heads up. He just decided to do whatever he wanted, like Ben's property was his for the taking. Ben stood still for a moment, trying to process what had happened. His father had always taught him that land was sacred. It wasn't just about ownership, it was about legacy, family, and respect. And yet here he was, staring at a mess that was the result of someone else's sense of entitlement. But Ben wasn't about to let this slide. He wasn't the type to back down. He'd spent his whole life building up to this point. He wasn't going to let Kyle take it away from him. As he walked back to the cabin, his mind began to race. What were his options? What could he do to fight back? But as the sun began to set, something clicked. He wasn't going to let Kyle win. Ben knew the law, and more importantly, he knew how to fight back. He wasn't about to let this bully get away with it. He'd been dealt a tough hand, but this was a fight he was ready for. And this time, it wasn't just about getting his land back. It was about standing up for what was right. Kyle had made a huge mistake, and Ben was going to make sure he paid for it. Ben stood in the driveway, looking at the pile of dirt, and the twisted remains of his fence. The entire situation felt like something out of a nightmare. He had worked hard for everything he had, and now it seemed like someone else had decided to tear it all down. Kyle Harris, the president of the local HOA, had always been a thorn in Ben's side, but this was different. This wasn't just about grass height or a mailbox being a little too big. This was about control. The more Ben thought about it, the angrier he got. He wasn't going to just sit back and let this happen. His grandfather had worked hard to build this cabin, and his father had passed it down to him, expecting him to take care of it. Now, Kyle was treating it like it was nothing. Ben took out his phone and pulled up the HOA's website. He didn't know much about HOA rules, but he knew enough to know that they couldn't just do whatever they wanted. There had to be regulations, right? He quickly searched through the documents, looking for anything that could help him. His eyes scanned the fine print, the legal jargon, until something caught his attention. There it was, an exemption clause. It stated that any construction or alterations on private property had to be approved by the property owner, or at least be in accordance with the zoning laws of the area. This was it. Ben knew right away that Kyle had broken the rules. The land was still Ben's, and Kyle had no right to come in and make these changes without his consent. Ben felt a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't powerless after all. The more he thought about it, the clearer the plan became. Ben had always been the quiet type, the kind of person who avoided conflict. But this was different. This wasn't just about his cabin. This was about standing up for what was right. He couldn't let Kyle walk all over him and get away with it. He needed to fight back, and he was going to do it in a way that Kyle wouldn't see coming. Ben called his lawyer, a no-nonsense attorney who had helped him with property matters in the past. They discussed the next steps, and Ben explained everything that had happened. The lawyer was confident that they could win this case. It wasn't just about property rights. It was about Kyle's abuse of power as the HOA president. Ben knew this wouldn't be easy. Kyle had connections, and he wasn't the type to back down. But Ben wasn't about to give up either. He was ready to take action. The next morning, Ben gathered all the necessary documents and prepared to file a formal complaint. He made sure to take pictures of the damage Kyle had caused, the spike strips, the fence, everything. The evidence was clear, and it was on his side. As Ben was about to leave for the courthouse, he spotted Kyle across the street, standing by his perfectly manicured lawn, as if nothing had happened. Kyle gave him a smug nod, clearly unaware of what was about to happen. Ben felt a fire ignite inside him. This was his moment. He wasn't going to let Kyle win. With all the paperwork in hand, Ben walked to the courthouse. The feeling of determination surged through him with every step. He wasn't just fighting for his land. He was fighting for his family's legacy, for the respect that had been taken from him. The legal battle was about to begin, and Ben was ready. He would make sure that Kyle would regret ever thinking he could take what wasn't his. Ben sat at his kitchen table, staring at the stack of legal documents before him. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, casting a warm glow across the room, but it did little to ease the tension in his chest. He had spent the entire night reviewing every piece of evidence he had gathered. Photos of the spike strips, the broken fence, the torn-up driveway, and the emails from Kyle Harris, the HOA president, outlining the upgrades Kyle had taken upon himself to make on Ben's property. Each document seemed to carry the weight of a battle that was just beginning, a battle Ben wasn't sure he was fully prepared for. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. It was his lawyer, Caroline. He picked it up, his mind still racing from the night's work. Ben, we've got a court date set for next week. We need to be ready. Caroline's voice was steady, but Ben could hear the underlying urgency. I've gone over the evidence, and it's solid. But we need to be prepared for Kyle's team to push back hard. This won't be a quick win, but I'm confident we can make this stick. Ben felt a small spark of hope. Caroline had always been the type to tell it like it was, and if she thought they had a chance, then maybe they did. Still, Ben knew this wasn't going to be easy. He'd seen how Kyle operated. He was well-connected, and the HOA had always been a tool for people like him to exert power over others. But Ben had a secret weapon. He knew the law, and he wasn't going to back down. Over the next few days, Ben spent every waking hour preparing for the fight ahead. He went over his strategy with Caroline, meticulously going over the laws that govern property rights and HOA regulations. He knew that Kyle had violated several rules, and now it was just a matter of proving it in court. The legal system was slow, but it was fair, and Ben was determined to make it work for him. As the court date approached, Ben couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and excitement. He was about to stand up to the very people who had tried to take what was his. He wasn't just fighting for the cabin. He was fighting for his family's legacy, for the respect that had been taken from him. When the day finally came, Ben walked into the courthouse with a sense of purpose. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his head high. He was ready. The courtroom was exactly what Ben had imagined, stuffy, quiet, and filled with the smell of old leather chairs and musty books. Ben sat in the front row, watching as Kyle's lawyer prepared his arguments. Kyle himself sat in the back, his face a mask of confidence, but Ben could see the subtle twitch of his fingers, betraying his nerves. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. It was time. Ben's lawyer, Caroline, stood first, presenting their case. She was calm, collected, and precise, walking the judge through the evidence step by step. The photos, the emails, the legal violations, everything was laid out clearly. Ben sat back, listening intently, as he knew this was his chance to finally take control of the situation. When it was Kyle's turn, Ben couldn't help but notice how smug Kyle looked, standing up to defend his actions. He tried to downplay everything, claiming it was just a misunderstanding, that Ben had been away and hadn't been aware of the improvements being made to the property. But it didn't take long for the judge to start poking holes in Kyle's defense. The legal documents were clear. Kyle had overstepped his bounds, and now he had to face the consequences. As the hearing went on, Ben's nerves slowly turned into a feeling of vindication. The more Kyle spoke, the more it became obvious that he had no real defense. His arrogance was finally catching up with him. After what felt like an eternity, the judge finally called for a brief recess. Ben's heart was racing as he stood up to stretch his legs. He stepped outside the courtroom, breathing in the fresh air, trying to calm his thoughts. It wasn't over yet, but it was looking good. When the judge returned, the courtroom went quiet once more. The decision was imminent. Ben sat up straighter, his palms sweaty, as he waited for the verdict. The judge spoke, and Ben's heart skipped a beat. "It is clear," the judge said, "that the actions taken by Mr. Harris were unlawful. The property rights of Mr. Reynolds were violated, and as such, the court orders the immediate removal of the alterations made to his property, as well as compensation for damages." Ben couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had won. Kyle Harris was finally being held accountable for his actions. The cabin was his again, and the legacy of his family was intact. Ben stood outside his cabin, watching as the construction crew began tearing down the spike strips and restoring the property to its original state. The sound of machinery and the sight of workers moving quickly was a relief. Everything was starting to feel right again. The court ruling had been a victory, but now, seeing the land being repaired, it felt like the final step in reclaiming what was rightfully his. Ben had always been a man of few words, preferring the solitude of the cabin to the chaos of the world, but today, he felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced before. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was Caroline, his lawyer. He answered quickly. "Ben, I just wanted to check in and make sure everything's going smoothly. How are things?" Ben looked around, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift from his shoulders. "It's all coming together. The work is being done, and the cabin's finally mine again." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I still can't believe it. I honestly thought Kyle would get away with it." Caroline's voice was calm but warm. "He tried, but you didn't give up. That's what made the difference." Ben smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "Yeah, well, it's not over yet. There's still a lot of work to do. But at least now, I know the land is mine, and no one can take it from me again." Caroline chuckled on the other end. "That's the spirit. You've got this, Ben. Just make sure to take some time for yourself now. You've earned it." Ben nodded, even though Caroline couldn't see him. "I will. I'm just glad it's over." After hanging up, Ben sat down on the porch, watching the workers finish their tasks. It had been a long and exhausting few weeks, but in the end, justice had prevailed. He had fought back against the person who had tried to take what was his, and now, the cabin was safe. For the first time in a long time, Ben felt like he could breathe. As the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the land, Ben thought about his family's legacy. His grandfather had built this cabin, and his father had passed it down to him, with the hope that Ben would take care of it and continue the tradition. Kyle Harris had come close to destroying that tradition, but Ben had stood firm, not only for himself, but for the memory of his grandfather and father. He stood up and walked to the edge of the property, looking out over the land. The fields were peaceful now, and for the first time in a long time, Ben felt at home. He wasn't just protecting a piece of land. He was protecting a part of his family's history. He was proud of what he had done, not just in the courtroom, but in standing up for what was right. Ben knew that there would be other challenges ahead. Life was never easy, and there were always obstacles to overcome. But for now, as he stood on the land that had been passed down through generations, Ben felt a sense of peace. He had won this battle, and he would be ready for whatever came next. The days that followed the court victory were a blur of relief and recovery. Ben had finally gotten his cabin back, But the emotional toll of the whole ordeal hadn't fully sunk in. There was a certain weight that lifted off his chest, but there was also a lingering sense of unease. His victory was hard-earned, but it came at a cost. The trust he had once had in his neighbors and in the HOA had shattered completely. Kyle Harris had shown Ben how far someone would go to impose their will, and while Ben had come out on top, he knew the battle wasn't just about property. It was about respect and the lengths people would go to abuse power. Still, Ben found solace in the quiet moments that followed. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the sight of his cabin standing strong after everything that had happened. It was a reminder that some things couldn't be taken away. Every morning, he'd take a walk around the property, watching as the landscape gradually returned to its natural state. The workers had finished up the repairs, but Ben couldn't help but inspect every corner, ensuring that everything was in place. It was his way of reclaiming control, of making sure that no one could ever do this to him again. Over the following weeks, life began to settle back into a routine. Ben spent more time at the cabin, enjoying the peace and solitude that had first drawn him here. He worked from home when he could, taking calls and making updates to his software projects, but it wasn't the same. The place that had once felt like an escape now felt like a fortress. And that's when it hit him. He wasn't just holding on to the land. He was holding on to the past. His grandfather's legacy, his father's love for the land, and now, his own sense of justice were all tied to this cabin. This wasn't just a property. This was a symbol of everything he stood for. But it wasn't just about the land. It was about something bigger. Ben had learned a valuable lesson through all of this. He had learned that standing up for what's right wasn't always easy, and sometimes you had to fight for what you believed in. He had to fight for his property, but in the process, he had also fought for his own dignity. He had fought for the memory of his family, and that was something he could never let go of. As Ben sat on his porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, he thought about what the future held. Kyle Harris was out of the picture for now, but Ben knew that there would always be challenges ahead. Life was never going to be simple, and people would always try to take what wasn't theirs. But Ben had learned how to stand his ground, how to defend what was his, and he wasn't going to forget that lesson anytime soon. The cabin was his. The land was his. And no one could ever take that from him again. Ben woke up early, as he often did now. The quiet of the morning was something he had grown accustomed to after everything that had happened. The soft light of dawn crept through the cabin's windows, and for a moment, he just stood there, letting the stillness wash over him. He had spent so much time fighting for what was his, but now, it was the simple things, like the peace that came with living on his own land, that mattered most. As he stepped outside, the crisp morning air filled his lungs, and the sounds of the forest slowly came to life. Birds chirped in the distance, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves of the trees surrounding the cabin. Ben stood on the porch for a while, taking it all in. The land was his again, and for the first time in months, he felt a deep sense of contentment. It was strange how quickly things could change. Just a few weeks ago, he had been fighting for the very thing he now stood on. But the court case, the legal battles, and the stress had all been worth it. The cabin, the land, it was all his again, and no one could take that away from him. As he walked toward the garden, Ben found himself reflecting on the journey that had led him here. It wasn't just about reclaiming his property. It was about more than that. It was about standing up. For himself, for his family's legacy, and for what he knew was right. In the end, it wasn't the legal victory that had mattered most. It was the principle behind it. He had taken on someone who thought they could push him around, and he had won. That was a victory that went beyond the courtroom. Ben spent the morning working around the cabin, clearing some brush and repairing a section of the fence that had been damaged during Kyle's interference. It was hard work, but Ben enjoyed it. There was something therapeutic about being out here, doing the work himself. It gave him a sense of ownership, not just over the land, but over his own life. As the day wore on, Ben decided to take a walk around the property. He hadn't done that in a while, and it felt good to get out and explore. The landscape had always been one of his favorite parts of the cabin. The sprawling fields, the tall trees, and the winding creek that ran along the edge of the property. Everything felt so peaceful, so timeless. He walked down the trail that led to the creek, the sound of the water flowing over the rocks filling the air. For a moment, Ben closed his eyes and listened to the rhythm of nature around him. It was soothing, almost like the world had slowed down just for him. As he opened his eyes again, his gaze shifted to the distant horizon. He thought about his grandfather, who had built the cabin all those years ago. Ben had inherited more than just the property. He had inherited a legacy. His grandfather had worked hard to build something that would last, something that could be passed down through generations. And now, it was Ben's turn to carry that legacy forward. The thought made him smile. He wasn't just protecting a piece of land. He was protecting his family's history, and that meant everything to him. He spent the rest of the afternoon walking the property, taking in the sights and sounds that made it feel like home. It was hard to believe that just a short time ago, this place had been under threat. But now, everything felt right again. Ben knew that there would always be challenges in life, but he was ready to face them. He had proven that he could stand up for what he believed in, and that gave him the strength to tackle whatever came next. As the sun began to set, Ben made his way back to the cabin. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfect. He wasn't just a man who had won a legal battle. He was a man who had earned his place in the world. The cabin, the land, and the memories of his family would always be a part of him. And no matter what happened next, Ben knew he was ready for whatever came his way. Ben spent the next few weeks settling into his newfound peace. The cabin was quiet again, the kind of quiet that was never unsettling but rather comforting, like a long sigh after holding your breath for too long. The battle with Kyle had taken more out of him than he had expected, and now it was time to let everything settle. He had started to take more time for himself, enjoying the simple pleasures of life, the slow mornings, the walks around the property, and the satisfaction of doing the work himself. It felt good to be back in control, to know that nothing would ever threaten this place again. But as time passed, Ben began to realize something he hadn't fully understood during the legal battles. The cabin was more than just a physical structure to him. It was a symbol of his connection to the past, to his family's legacy. His grandfather had built it, his father had maintained it, and now it was Ben's turn to keep it alive. The responsibility weighed on him in a way he hadn't anticipated, but it was a responsibility he accepted willingly. He wanted to honor the generations that had come before him. On a Saturday morning, Ben decided to take a drive into town. It had been a while since he'd interacted with anyone outside of his small circle, and he figured it might be nice to pick up a few supplies and catch up with some old friends. As he walked into the local hardware store, he was greeted by the familiar face of Ted, the store owner. Ted was the kind of guy who knew everyone in town, and his dry humor and no-nonsense attitude had made him a local legend. Well, if it isn't Ben. Reynolds, back from the land of legal battles and spike strips, Ted said with a grin. How's the cabin holding up? Ben chuckled, shaking his head. It's good. Better than good, actually. It feels like things are finally back to normal. Glad to hear it. I heard about what went down with Kyle. Never thought that guy had it in him. But I guess you can't really judge a book by its cover, huh? Ben's smile faded slightly, but he nodded. Yeah, well, I guess some people will do anything to get what they want. True, Ted said, his tone turning more serious. But you did the right thing. Not many folks would have fought back like you did. Most people just let things slide, but you stood your ground. Ben shifted uncomfortably, not used to receiving praise for something that felt so personal. I had to. It wasn't just about the land. It was about respect. About standing up for what's mine. Ted nodded knowingly. I get that. And that's why you'll always have the respect of folks like me. Not everyone has that kind of courage. Ben thanked Ted and gathered the few items he needed before heading back to the cabin. The drive back was calming. The roads were empty, and the sun was starting to set, casting a golden hue over the landscape. Ben thought about the conversation with Ted. He hadn't realized how much he had changed over the past few weeks. The quiet man who had once avoided confrontation was now someone who stood up for what he believed in, no matter the cost. He had fought for his land, his family's legacy, and in doing so, he had found a part of himself he hadn't known existed. Back at the cabin, Ben spent the rest of the evening sitting on the porch, watching the stars slowly appear in the sky. The land stretched out before him, peaceful and serene. He thought about what the future held. There would be more challenges ahead, of course. Life wasn't ever going to be simple, and there would always be obstacles to face. But Ben knew one thing for sure. He was ready. He had learned how to stand up for himself, how to fight for what he believed in, and how to protect the things that mattered most. The cabin was his, and no one could take that away. from him. And with that thought, Ben finally allowed himself to relax. The battle was over. The land was his. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. Ben had settled into a rhythm that felt natural, almost as if the cabin had accepted him back, as though it was always meant to be his. The mornings were slow and peaceful, filled with the kind of quiet he had craved for years. His work was steady, though he found himself spending more time tending to the land than his projects. He would wake early to watch the sun rise over the fields, sometimes with a cup of coffee in hand, other times just taking in the peaceful silence. He had found something new in those moments, a sense of connection to the land that he hadn't felt before. One afternoon, while Ben was walking the property, he stumbled upon an old, overgrown path leading deeper into the woods. He hadn't noticed it before, and it intrigued him. The path seemed to disappear into the trees, swallowed by the thick undergrowth. Ben hesitated for a moment, then decided to follow it. As he made his way through the woods, the further he walked, the more he could feel the weight of history around him. This was land that had been in his family for generations, and for the first time, Ben felt like he was truly connected to it. After what felt like an eternity of walking, the path opened up to a clearing, and in the center of it, Ben found a small, dilapidated cabin. It was barely standing, with one of the walls caving in and the roof sagging. The wood was weathered and worn, but there was something undeniably familiar about it. He approached cautiously, unsure of what he was looking at. As he stepped closer, a memory surfaced. His grandfather had mentioned an old cabin on the property, one that had been abandoned years ago. Ben's heart skipped a beat. Could this be it? His curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped inside the cabin. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked under his weight. It was clear that no one had been here in years. But as Ben looked around, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The old cabin had character. It had history. This was where his grandfather had spent his early years, and now, it was Ben's responsibility to keep that history alive. He spent the next few hours exploring the cabin, cleaning it up as best as he could. It wasn't much, but there was something about it that made him feel grounded. This wasn't just about restoring a building. It was about restoring a piece of his family's past. By the time the sun started to set, Ben had made up his mind. He was going to fix this cabin up, just like he had the main house. It would take time, effort, and resources, but he was determined. It was part of his heritage, and he wasn't about to let it fade away. As he stood in the clearing, looking back at the cabin, Ben realized that this place, this property, was his legacy. It wasn't just about a house or land. It was about family, about memory, and about honor. The feeling of peace he had felt on the porch just a few weeks ago now felt even more profound. He wasn't just fighting for a plot of land. He was fighting to preserve the past. Ben knew there would be challenges ahead, both with the land and with life in general, but he felt ready. He had faced the hard battles before, and this new project, the restoration of this old cabin, was one that would connect him even more deeply to his roots. It was a new chapter, one that would require patience and dedication, but he was committed to seeing it through. As the evening light faded into dusk, Ben walked back to the main cabin, the sounds of the woods quieting behind him. He felt an overwhelming sense of pride, not just in his property, but in his heritage. It was something that no one could ever take from him. This land, this cabin, this legacy, he would protect it with everything he had. Ben spent the next few weeks getting his hands dirty with the restoration of the old cabin. It wasn't a quick fix, but that was part of the beauty of it. Each nail he hammered into the walls, each piece of wood he carefully replaced, was a small act of respect to the generations before him. It was more than just fixing a structure. It was about reconnecting with the past. His grandfather had built this cabin with his own hands, and now Ben was doing the same. It wasn't easy work, but it was work that grounded him in a way he hadn't felt before. There were days when the cabin felt like a mountain, and he wasn't sure how he would ever finish. But then, when the sun began to set, casting the land in a golden hue, he'd look back and see how much progress he had made. And it was enough. His progress wasn't always measured by how fast he worked, but by the care he put into it. On weekends, he would take long walks around the property, letting the world slow down around him. He spent hours thinking about his family, his grandfather, his father, and the history of this place. He thought about the future too, about the legacy he would leave behind. There was something about the land that felt eternal, like it was always meant to be here, a part of something bigger than any one person. One afternoon, while working on the roof of the cabin, Ben heard the sound of an approaching car. It wasn't the sound of an unfamiliar vehicle. He recognized it. It was Ted's truck. Ted had always been a fixture in Ben's life. He had known Ben's grandfather, and now he was one of the few people Ben trusted to give him advice on the property. Ted parked the truck and climbed out, his usual smile on his face. "Looks like you're making good progress here," Ted called out, tipping his hat. "It's coming along," Ben said, stepping down from the roof and wiping his hands on his jeans. "There's still a lot to do, but it feels good to see it taking shape." Ted nodded, looking around the property. "You know, your grandfather would be proud," he said, his voice full of warmth. "He always talked about the land with so much love. It's good to see you carrying that on." Ben smiled, a little embarrassed. "I hope I'm doing it justice." "You are," Ted said. "You've got the right spirit for it." The two of them sat down on the porch, watching the workers finish up some of the final touches. The air was cool, the sounds of the forest peaceful, and for a moment, it felt like time stood still. Ted didn't talk much. He didn't need to. He simply enjoyed the quiet, just like Ben. It was the kind of friendship that didn't need constant words, just the shared understanding of the land, of history, and of family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, orange light across the fields, Ben looked at the cabin. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was close. It was his now, and he was ready to pass it down, just as his grandfather had done. Ted clapped Ben on the back before getting up. "Well, I'll leave you to it, Ben," he said. "Keep at it. You've got this." Ben watched as Ted walked back to his truck, and for the first time in a while, he didn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Everything was falling into place. The land was his, the cabin was his, and with every passing day, he felt more and more connected to it all. The land was more than just property. It was a part of him, and he knew he would protect it, not just for himself, but for the generations that would come after him. As night fell and the stars appeared overhead, Ben stood alone in the quiet, looking out at the place that was now his. The battle had been hard, but the victory felt sweet. He wasn't just restoring an old cabin. He was restoring a legacy, and that was worth every ounce of effort.